Welcome to the Representation Project's End Rape Campaign Expert Interview Series. I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project, and we are a gender justice organization that envisions a world free of harmful and damaging gender norms and stereotypes. We were founded by Jennifer Siebel Newsom, the now first partner of California, back in 2011, after the incredible success of her first film, Misrepresentation. And since that time, she directed and produced The Mask You Live In, that looks at the harms of traditional masculinity to boys and men. And then The Great American Lie, that came out in 2019, looking at how gender intersects with race in the historical context to deny folks the American dream. And most recently in 2022, her film Fair Play focused on how gender inequality in the home harms children, harms couples, harms the family unit, and harms society. So check out our films, folks. We are very much dedicated to eradicating sexual violence, which is one of the primary outcomes of patriarchy and gender injustice in our society. And I am so happy today to be introducing Dr. Alissa Ackerman. Prior to jumping in, though, I want to say this is a conversation about sexual violence. So if you are triggered or activated, or anticipate that you will be, this will be recorded and shared within 24 hours. You'll be able to access it for free online. So it might be better if you believe you'll be triggered or activated to watch it, not in real time, but later on, so that you can control the content and how much you're consuming at what point. Back by popular demand, Dr. Alissa Ackerman is a professor of criminal justice and a sex crimes expert. For more than 15 years, she has studied every aspect of sexual abuse and the criminal justice policies after sexual abuse occurs. Dr. Ackerman is an internationally recognized author and scholar. She has been awarded for her contributions to the field and her innovative approach that has helped hundreds of people in their path toward healing. And of course, she has published, her bio says several books. I think it's maybe numerous books at this point. She has written extensively on topics related to sexual abuse. And her most recent book is a 2022 publication called Survivor Criminology, A Radical Act of Hope. Welcome, Dr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Dr. Heldman. It's good to be back with you.
So good to see you. I will say, just, to be for the record, have we written 2 books together? I think we've written 2 books together, maybe a few articles. I'm a huge fan of your work, as you know, and especially your work on restorative justice, not just the academic side of things, but also the application. So I want to talk to you because you're the foremost expert on restorative justice and sexual violence. As a scholar and advisor and a practitioner. Can you tell us, for folks who are unfamiliar with this concept, what is restorative justice and how is it used in addressing sexual violence?
Yeah, so restorative justice is a framework. It is not one thing that we do. So it is a framework under which many different practices can fall. And so really it is a way that we move through the world that centers the humanity of all people. And that can be really, really hard for people to wrap their heads around when we are thinking about those who have perpetrated sexual harm. We have a tendency to monsterize people who have perpetrated harm, but restorative justice centers the humanity of all people. Secondly, it centers the harm that has been caused. So while criminal legal policies center perpetrators of harm, right? The whole process is about the person who has perpetrated the harm and what they deserve, right? Determining whether they are guilty and what they deserve after they are found guilty. Restorative justice centers the survivor and the harm they have experienced. So that it can look like a lot of different things depending on what it is that the survivor wants. So the kinds of questions that we ask are, what happened? How are you impacted? And what do you need? And typically the things that survivors say that they need to be believed. They have questions that they need answers to. They need information, right? And sometimes there are tangible things that they need from the person who harmed them. And so restorative justice practices center those things. And so we call it a framework because we can get really creative into how we get to those needs. So sometimes it's a one-on-one conversation, right? The survivor says, I just want to sit down and have a conversation with the person who perpetrated the harm. I just want to ask these questions. I want those questions answered. Sometimes it's a conversation with a larger group of people. Sometimes it's a community of people, right? So I've facilitated conversations with survivors, the person who harmed them, and all of their college friends, because the college friends didn't believe them when they came forward, and they needed vindication from all of their friends, right? Sometimes it's a conversation with family members and community members. Sometimes it's no conversation at all, but it's a facilitator shuttling letters back and forth between the two parties. Sometimes it's an art piece that the survivor creates that they want the person who perpetrated the harm to see and then respond to, right? So it really, really centers that survivor in a way that no criminal legal process can do, because it's not designed to do. And so we always come back to that question: what is it that you need? What do you want from this process? And what are your goals? And then we create processes that meet those goals. But I say we are human-centered. So we are also centering the humanity of the person who perpetrated the harm. Because if we are dehumanizing them, we are never going to meet the needs of the survivor, right? Because so often what the survivor needs is to hear real accountability, right? I did this to you, and naming it specifically. I understand the way that my actions have impacted you. I'm taking real actionable steps to ensure that I never do this again. And I'm going to honor the accountability measures that you need, right? So maybe it's, I'm going to tell my friends the truth because that's what you need. I'm going to tell my family. I'm going to pay for your therapy. And so the role of the facilitator is to get the harm doer to do those things. That takes a lot of really hard work, right? So I call it a human-centered approach to repairing and preventing harm, but it can look like many different things to get there.
So it's not for everyone, right? Who are some of the prime candidates, both survivors and perpetrators, for whom this works best, and who might it not work with?
Yeah, so this is definitely not for everybody. So I will be the first person to tell you that. When I created my organization, Ampersand's Restorative Justice, I did so to create options for survivors who wanted the opportunity to have a process like this. But this has to be voluntary, right? You cannot force a survivor into a process like this. So survivors have to want this. So who is this not for? This is not for survivors who have just experienced harm, right? So oftentimes the survivors that I'm working with are those who, you know, the harm happened years ago. They have gone through some form of therapy. They've already done other healing work. And then there's just this missing piece. But to go through a trauma and then immediately go sit with the harm doer, that's not something that we recommend. So it's not for harm that just happened. And it's not for those who have caused harm who cannot accept accountability, right? So, you know, people who just will never acknowledge that they did something wrong, for those who feel no remorse, who have no empathy, who are super, super entrenched in what we call cognitive distortions, so distorted ways of thinking, this process is not for them. People who have engaged in egregious forms of violence, I wouldn't take those kinds of cases unless they went through, long-term sex offense specific treatment before they went through a restorative justice process. So we have a very extensive assessment process that we do both for survivors and for harm doers before we enter into a restorative justice process to ensure that people are ready for something like this. So we look for things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, because the process is intended to do no additional harm, right? So somebody who is in active PTSD is not a good candidate for restorative justice. It doesn't mean we turn them away. It just says you're not a good candidate right now. And survivors who are looking for retribution, are not good candidates for this, right? So people who want restorative justice are those who are looking for answers, who are looking for dialogue and accountability. But accountability and punishment are not the same thing. So we can push harm doers to do things that might be uncomfortable for them. But restorative justice is not about doing things that are harmful to them. So that's what a survivor is looking for. They're not a good candidate for restorative justice. And if a harm doer is looking to do a process simply because they want access to a survivor, that's not a reason we wouldn't put them in a room with a survivor. So we are very, very careful about the people that we bring to processes.
So talk to us more about that. Let's say I'm a survivor. I've come to you. I've contacted ampersand Restorative Justice, and I want to get this process started. What can I expect? What are the nuts and bolts? I know you provided some examples. And in answering that question, like, what is your process? You talked a bit about making sure the motives work, that, you know, we're not talking about an active case of PTSD or retribution, but what should I expect and how do you manage that process?
Yeah, so we use a 5-stage process. So whether it's a one-on-one process, a circle process, or an institutional case where we're working with a church or a synagogue or a larger institution, it's always a 5-stage process. So we start with first contact, which is typically, you know, a 30 to 60-minute conversation. Typically, it starts with a survivor who says, I'm interested in the process. We introduce what restorative justice is. We introduce, you know, ourselves as the facilitator. We learn a little bit about the case and what they're looking for, briefly about what their, you know, needs and wants and goals are for the process. We do some expectation setting. And if there are any major red flags, like I want major retribution, we would say you're not a good candidate at that point. If there are no major red flags that we see, we move on to what the second phase, which is intake and assessment. And at that phase, we are looking at actuarial assessments for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And then we do a clinical intake, a clinical assessment. So it's like an hour-long interview with a licensed clinical social worker. And so this is really, like, it's very comprehensive so that we resource the survivor, right? So we are looking at things like active drug addiction, PTSD, things like that. Because when we are dealing with sexual trauma, as you know, this is a different kind of trauma than other kinds of trauma. And we need to make sure that the survivor is properly resourced. Because going through a process like this, where we are digging into the ways that the trauma has impacted them, can bring out a whole lot of stuff. And if there's active drug addiction, if there's, you know, mental illness that is not properly dealt with, it brings stuff up. So we deal with that stuff first. And if it is not properly addressed, we provide the resources, we outsource to provide the resources, and then we move forward. So sometimes at that stage, we have to pause until the survivor is properly resourced before we can move forward. It's usually around that stage that we move out, or that we reach out to the harm doer, and we ask them if they would be willing to come to a conversation. It's usually in an email, and it's usually a very vague email. You know, so-and-so has reached out. They have indicated that some harm has happened, and they are interested in having a conversation with you in a restorative justice process. We explain what restorative justice is, and we ask them if they'd be willing to have an initial conversation. Surprisingly, most of the time, harm doers come to the table for an initial conversation. That initial conversation is very similar to the conversation that we have with survivors about expectations around the process, what a process will typically look like. And we explain to the harm doer, we are not attorneys. These are not privileged conversations. If at any point the survivor decides they want to go through a criminal legal process, we can be subpoenaed. But we take precautions to protect our clients. So I don't keep any written notes about things that harm doers say to me in an effort to protect them. But surprisingly, like, you would really be surprised at how many harm doers say, I want to take accountability for the harm that I caused. So we do an intake and assessment with them as well: depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a readiness for change assessment. Because if that readiness for change assessment shows that they're not interested in doing any change, there's no point in going through with a process with them. And so we would go to the survivor and say, this isn't going to go anywhere. And at that point, if it wasn't going to go anywhere, we would offer them a vicarious restorative justice process where they would have the opportunity to sit with a surrogate who could take accountability and answer questions for them, which is not the same as sitting with the person who harmed them, but it is very powerful to hear somebody take accountability. If both parties are able to move forward, we move to what we call pre-conference work. And so this is where the magic happens. So most people think the magic happens in the restorative justice process itself. It actually happens in the pre-conference work. So with survivors, we really get down to the nuts and bolts. Like, what are your needs here? Let's get down to the nitty gritty. What are your needs? What are your wants? And what are your goals for this process? So we can start designing what the process is going to look like. And we can start working with the person who harmed you to start meeting those needs. We then start working on impacts of harm, because so many survivors are completely unaware of the way that sexual trauma is actually impacting them. So we talk about the impacts of sexual harm from an educational perspective, right? Not from a clinical perspective. We are not clinicians, but we do like a psychoeducation model on the different ways that sexual trauma might be impacting them, because that then helps refine, well, what are my needs for this process? Mm. And then we do a lot of work on communication skills, how to effectively communicate to the person who harmed us so that they can hear us. Because if we come to this conversation very defensive, if we come to this conversation, you, they are going to shut down. They are not going to hear us. So we do a lot of coaching around I statements, I felt, I need, I experienced, and we help them to craft their story in a way that uses that language so that the person who perpetrated the harm can really hear them. Simultaneously, we are working with the perpetrator of harm to deal with any rationalizations, excuses, and minimizations for their behavior. We also work with them on understanding impacts of harm, and we work with them on writing an active apology. We call it an amends. So I will not bring a perpetrator of harm to a conversation with a survivor unless they can do several things. Number one, they must specifically be able to name the harm that they caused, right? I raped you. They have to be able to say that. I now understand the ways that that rape impacted you. I've learned about that. These are the steps that I am taking to ensure that I never behave that way again, because I have done the work to understand why I did it in the first place. These are the choices that I made that led up to that rape. And so these are the steps I'm taking to ensure I don't do it again. I'm going to AA, I'm whatever it is. Right? And I'm willing to accept the accountability measures that you need me to accept. If they can't do those things, there is no conversation. So that's really, really hard work, right? So we're not moving to the conversation until the survivor has the story written out. They are able to speak to it without being triggered by talking about the story. Now, of course, they're going to experience emotions around it. So they're able to talk about the story. They know what their needs are. They know what their wants are. They can articulate them. And the person who perpetrated the harm can name it, can own it, can talk about their understanding of it, and can accept accountability measures. And then we will move to a facilitated dialogue. So that's really, really hard work. And it's the whole thing centers the survivor. They are in the driver's seat the whole time, which is very, very different from a criminal legal process.
And how long does it usually take?
It depends. So sometimes, you know, when parties come to the table together, when they've already had an initial conversation, it can be, 1 to 3 months, but I've had cases take 18 months. because the person who perpetrated the harm was just so entrenched in their justifying their behavior. So it took longer. I've had cases that started with a one-on-one process, and then the survivor said, that wasn't enough for me. I need to sit with our friends now, or I need to sit with our family now. And so it, it started with a one-on-one process, but then we engaged more stakeholders. And so the process just kept getting bigger and bigger because, as you know, the impacts of sexual harm ripple out, right? They don't, it doesn't just, it's not just the instance of harm. They ripple out across the lifespan. And so do the ripples of healing. And that's what restorative justice provides, right? And so when you get that taste of healing in that one conversation, well, then maybe you can have it in the next conversation and the next conversation. So, sometimes a case is a one-off case and it's done in a month. And sometimes, the two people are so committed to the healing together that it continues for months and months and months.
Can you give us an example of when restorative justice worked really well with whatever level of obviously anonymity you respect and uphold, and also a case where it didn't work?
Yeah. I can give you a couple of examples of cases where it worked really well. So one that I'm thinking of was a case a couple of years ago. It was a survivor who was raped in college 20 years ago. And it just had destroyed her life. And she reached out to me because she wanted the opportunity to sit with the man who raped her. She had reached out to him on Facebook, and they had a Facebook conversation online, and then decided that they really needed somebody to facilitate the conversation. So we met at a church in Northern California. We had rented out a room in a church, and we did a 4-hour process. And there was nobody else at the church. It was pouring rain in Marin County that day. We did this 4-hour process. And at the end of the process, the survivor turned to me and she said, I want you to leave now. And I said, you want me to leave you in an empty church with the man who raped you? And she said, yes, I want some time to talk to him alone. So it started with her walking into this room, terrified to be in the space with him. And at one point, even in the conversation, when I asked her about the impact that this rape had had on her life, she said, well, you can answer that from your own experience. And I said, this isn't about me. This is about you. This is your opportunity to speak about the impacts on your life. Like, she couldn't even get the words out of her mouth. But by the end of the process, it was so powerful that she asked me to leave her in a church alone with the man who had raped her. So I left the church. I drove to my in-laws' house about an hour away. And when I got there, I had a text from her, and it was a picture of her and him. It was a selfie of the two of them. And it just said, we've decided we're going to remain friends.
Wow.
After 20 years of this destroying her life. Similarly, I just finished in July, a vicarious restorative justice case. So a case where it was a surrogate harm doer with a woman in her 60s who was an incest case, somebody in her family who sexually abused her when she was a child. And she has had long-term mental health effects her entire life. She's been on medication her entire life. And after this process in July, for the first time in her life, she is off all psychiatric medications.
One moment, Dr. Ackerman. I think there's an issue with your sound. It just went down dramatically.
Can you hear me?
That's better. Yep, thank you.
So after a lifetime on psychiatric medication, she went through a vicarious restorative justice process, and for the first time in her life is off medication. Those are the kinds of outcomes we are seeing from restorative justice. So those are individual cases. I will also talk about an institutional case. So a colleague of mine and I are working with the largest Jewish denomination in North America. It's a very, very public case. We have written a report after talking with 26 survivors who were harmed within this institution. who really wanted the institution to take accountability for the secondary harm, for not listening to survivors, just for the secondary harm, the institutional harm. We've worked with the denomination for a year, and 2 weeks ago they issued their public amends. And survivors who were just, destroyed by this institution have said, for the first time ever, we feel heard, we feel seen, we feel like we can come back to this movement, because all they wanted was the acknowledgement. But it took learning. It took us teaching the denomination about what secondary harm is and about how harmful it is, how it's sometimes more harmful than the initial harm. But they did the work and they issued the apology. It was very, very public, and it changed lives. So those are cases that have gone really well. I don't really have cases that haven't gone well, because I stop cases when I see them not going well, right? So when I see, people who have perpetrated harm who just aren't taking accountability, I give them a chance. I'm very direct and assertive with them about where I see this going. And if it continues to go that way, I fire them. I'm not going to sit harm doers in a room with survivors if they're going to cause more harm.
That makes total sense. So those are some great examples of how powerful restorative justice can be for some survivors. What does the data say on the effectiveness of restorative justice in terms of preventing future violence and any other outcomes of interest?
Yeah. So the literature on restorative justice generally for violent crimes is very clear. It reduces recidivism. Survivors are generally very satisfied with these processes, as are those who have perpetrated harm. And we see reductions in recidivism. The literature on restorative justice for sexual harms is admittedly a much smaller body of literature, because there just aren't as many people doing restorative justice for sexual harm. One, there's just not as many facilitators. And two, there's a belief that we shouldn't be using restorative justice for sexual harm. Now, what the literature is clear on is that restorative justice is most effective for more serious forms of harm. So when you hear people say, well, we should just use these for the low-level nonviolent offenses, that's not where it's effective. It's effective for harms like this. So studies like Mary Costa's study in 2014 of the Restore program, which was the only evaluation study to date, real evaluation study to date, was really effective. Survivors were satisfied over 90% of the time. So restorative justice is effective. It does reduce recidivism. And what we know about people who perpetrate sex crimes more generally is that they actually have quite low recidivism rates anyway. And I believe that it reduces rates of recidivism. I don't have any way to track that data because I'm not working within the criminal legal system. And the only way that I could track that is if my client self-reported to me that they had re-perpetrated a harm, which I don't think that they would do. But generally speaking, the kinds of things that clients are doing and continue to do as accountability measures leads me to believe that they are not harming people, right? Like they are continuing to actively engage in accountability measures. They are speaking publicly about the harms that they have committed. They are actively engaged in treatment. They are actively engaged in AA and NA and, SA. Like they're actively doing these things because they have learned about the impacts of their behavior. Does that mean that there aren't going to be people who reoffend? No. Of course, there are going to be people who reoffend. But generally, the literature shows that restorative justice reduces rates of reoffending.
Thank you. 2 questions, and folks should hop into the Q&A. Make sure to get your questions in. We'll spend the whole hour, the remainder of the hour, focused on your questions. I have two more quick questions, hopefully quick. One is, what do you say to the folks who say that restorative justice shouldn't be used for sexual violence because we already don't take this crime seriously, and RJ is like giving folks a slap on the wrist instead of true accountability?
I would tell them to sit in on a session with me working with a perpetrator of harm. I have worked with over 500 people who have perpetrated harm, and almost all of them have told me that they would rather sit in a prison cell than face me. It is easy. It is passive to sit in a prison cell. And we don't take this seriously in the real world. The vast majority of people who perpetrate sexual harm don't go through a criminal legal process. Right? So we don't take this seriously. But people who are willing to come to the table and go through a process like this is the hardest thing they will ever do. I can tell you, this is a personal story. I may have shared this the last time we spoke. The restorative justice process that I went through was a vicarious restorative justice process. And the first session that I went through was with a group of men who had all perpetrated sexual harm. And one of the men in the group had served 20 years in prison for a rape that was very similar to the one that I experienced. And I had an instant connection with this man. And when he was graduating from treatment, we ended up doing a one-on-one vicarious restorative justice process together, where he agreed to allow me to read the police report in his case, which is how I know how similar the rape he committed was to mine. And then we did this process where in the first part of the process, I talked as if I was the woman that he raped. So I talked about it as if I had experienced the rape that he committed. And then in the second part of the process, I talked about the impact of my own rape, right? The impact on my own life. And he was sobbing. Like, he had no idea. He said, I sat in a prison cell for 20 years and I never once thought about the woman that I harmed. I thought about how angry I was at the system. I thought about myself, but I never once thought about the woman that I harmed. And I'm sitting here with you. You could have been the woman that I raped. Like, you're a person. I did this to somebody. And it took that connection for him to really understand the impact of what he did. And I got to say it to somebody who really needed to hear it. It's not easy to face the worst thing you've ever done. So for critics who say, well, this is just a slap on the wrist, it is not. Accountability is hard work. Sitting in a prison cell is easy. It's passive, and accountability is active. And it requires continuing to live in amends. That's not easy. So until you've experienced it, you can criticize it all you want. But I have done this with over 500 people, and I have witnessed its power. I believe in this as a survivor. I believe in this as a practitioner. And I believe in this as an academic who has culled the literature and has read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles on this. The literature is clear. This is effective. It is powerful, and it is not easy.
Well, that's a great segue to my last question, which is, you're going to recommend, I know we're going to put a link with resources with this video, but what would you recommend 2 or 3 things that folks should read to learn more about RJ?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would recommend is a law review article that I wrote in 2022. It was in the CUNY Law Review. It's called Restorative Justice for Sexual Harm. It's a very personal piece, but it is also, it brings together a lot of the academic literature as well. And then if you're interested in also a personal piece, I actually didn't include it here, but it's a Psychology Today piece that talks about my first experience of restorative justice and just how powerful it was to move through something like that and how healing it was. And then there's some great TED Talks out there with people who have perpetrated harm, with survivors who have gone through processes.
Well, we have some great questions, and thank you for those recommendations. We will link them with the video. Anonymous asks, thank you for all the work you do. Have your views on restorative justice, or even what justice means for survivors, changed since you started this work?
Yes. So I would say when I started this work, when I started doing academic work 20 years ago, I believed that people who perpetrated sexual violence should rot in prison. I was so angry. And then I took a class on sex crimes, and I realized that if I wanted to end sexual violence, I had to work with people who perpetrated it. And then when I finally took down the Dr. Ackerman shield and sat with people who perpetrated harm as a survivor, and then sat with other survivors, it shifted everything. Right? Like, so many people who perpetrate harm really don't understand the impact of their actions. They should, right? In 2023, they should, and they don't. And call out culture, cancel culture, it's not going to get them to understand it. Call in culture, empathy, sitting, having real heart-centered conversations with people. That is what's going to get people to change. So yes, it has absolutely shifted what I think justice is. Because I didn't think there was justice in the world for me until I experienced it by sitting with a man who had sat in prison for 20 years. And I got justice.
Wow. Another anonymous question. In your work, have you noticed ways that friends and family attempt to support survivors but fall short? What do you wish people knew about essentially best practices for supporting survivors?
Yeah, a lot of times family and friends attempt to support survivors and fall short because of the questions that they ask. And so best practices for restorative justice is to prepare support people to. So when a survivor asks for family members or friends to be support people in these processes, we also sit with those support people to prepare them to participate fully in these processes. How do you best be a support person? What does your nonverbal communication say? How do we ensure that you are prepared to sit in a way that your nonverbal supports the survivor? What questions are appropriate? Why are those questions appropriate? What questions aren't appropriate? And that is key, right? Like, when people are not prepared for these processes, they go very, very wrong. So you prepare everybody for them. And it's both in how to communicate verbally and non-verbally, what's okay to ask, what's not okay to ask.
Yeah, because in asking that, you're questioning. And I think a survivor, the first thing I always say is, I believe you, because they have perhaps gone to other people and that's not the case. But your point, you're making a really good point that the questions they're asking could possibly be causing the survivor to internalize guilt and shame and re-victimize them. Yeah. So if a survivor comes to you, your first reaction, do you have a plan when survivors disclose to you?
Always, I believe you. Thank you so much for sharing. I know this was not easy. I believe you. What is it that you need? And how can I best support you?
That's it. There's your response. Family and friends, there's your response. I'm going to grab a therapy cat for the next question. It's a big one. This is Stokely. Earlier, you saw Harvey, all the therapy kittens. Anonymous asks, what are the root causes of sexual violence and domestic violence? What are the root causes? Simple one.
So, there are many, many reasons why sexual violence and domestic violence happens. The root cause is white supremacy and patriarchy. At a macro level, there are also micro level reasons, but we can't dismiss the macro level. So we think about this as a micro level problem, and we treat it as a micro level problem, but it is not a micro level problem. And so we can keep trying to punish bad actors, But if we do not address the macro level issue, which is white supremacy and patriarchy, we will not do away with sexual violence and domestic violence. I could teach a whole graduate seminar on the causes of sexual violence. Domestic violence is not my specialty. Sexual violence is. But fundamentally, if we're going to get down to it, it is white supremacy and patriarchy.
It's about power. I mean, people often say, right, that, well, rape isn't about sex, it's about power. Can you unpack that further?
So yes and no. We are moving away from this idea that rape is about power. That is certainly a part of it, right? There's this really phenomenal book that I am recommending to everybody right now. It is called Sexual Citizens. And it is about a 5-year study that was done at Columbia University. And it's all about, it's about sexual assault, but it is also about consensual sex among college-age students. And it's all about sexual citizenship and what that means, right? Like, we all have the right to sexual citizenship, and we all have different reasons why we engage in sexual activity, or what they call sexual projects. And one of the main reasons why sexual violence happens, especially among young people, is because we do not, as adults, we do not equip young people with an understanding of what their sexual projects are. And we make it a very shameful thing. Like, there are lots and lots of reasons why young people might want to have sex. It could be because they want to accrue lots of sexual experience. It could be because they just want to find one intimate partner. It could be because they want to explore queer sex. It could be any number of things, but we're not talking to young people about it. And what's interesting is that in this 5-year study, what Hirsch and Kahn found was that, you know, young people are thinking about these sexual projects, but the people that they are thinking about these sexual projects with, they're not thinking about them as people. They're thinking about them as objects. And so no wonder sexual assault is happening. So consensual sex is looking a lot like assault. And the other piece of this is we're not thinking about sexual geographies, right? Where is sex happening? Where is sexual assault happening? And this is sort of where power and privilege play into this, right? If you are a poor college student on a campus like Columbia, you're not going to be able to hop in an Uber and head home after a night of drinking with your buddies. You might stay in a place where you're not comfortable because you don't have the funds that your rich college friends have. And the people who have the power and the privilege own the space, right? So I think power and privilege becomes more nuanced when we start thinking of this conversation around our sexual projects and sexual geographies. And so power and privilege definitely plays a role, but I think it is more nuanced in the way that we have thought about it over the last 30 years.
I couldn't agree more. I wrote a bit about this in The Sexy Lie, about what it means to have girls and women dehumanized through mass, just totally normalized sexual objectification. Which is not sexuality, which is not sexual expression or power for girls and women. It's, it's being reduced to sex objects, and what that means on a mass scale when you're dehumanized. And I know you've written about this as well. Something that ties into that, Becca asks, thank you for your expertise, Dr. Ackerman. What research doesn't exist that you wish did?
That's a great question. What research doesn't exist that I wish?
You get a big check.
So I would love to see some longitudinal research on the impacts of restorative justice for sexual harm, right? So I'm trained as a methodologist, and I have moved away from doing evaluation research because it is unethical to be a practitioner and a researcher of the as a practitioner, right? And I felt that it was more important to be a practitioner. So it's not that I'm not keeping data, but I can't publish that data. And I do follow up with my clients. I do follow up and debriefing at 3 days and at a month. I would love to see follow up at a year. I'd love to see follow up at 5 years. At the long-term impacts of participating in restorative justice, both for survivors and those who have perpetrated harm. Right? Like, what are the long-term rippling impacts of this, and how does it really change lives and relationships? And that doesn't exist.
That would be great research. So needed. Anonymous asks or says, you mentioned that restorative justice is best facilitated years later after some healing has taken place. I imagine for some people, waiting that long can be difficult or concerning. What would you recommend for accountability for the harm doer in the meantime?
Yeah. So oftentimes, this is going to be a long-winded way of getting to that answer. So I often have harm doers who reach out to me asking to take accountability. And accountability can happen without a survivor present. I will never reach out to a survivor on behalf of a harm doer. That is not survivor-centered, and it can be incredibly harmful. But accountability work can happen with the harm doer immediately, right? Helping somebody to understand that they did something wrong, what the impact of that harm is, and steps that they can take to not behave that way again. That does not require the presence of somebody who was harmed. And it is not incumbent upon somebody who has been harmed to bare their souls to somebody in order to get that accountability to happen. Right? So accountability work and restorative justice are not the same thing. Right? We can do accountability work with harm doers all the time. It does not require a survivor to achieve that. And that can happen right away. Right? So a survivor can come forward and disclose that harm happened, and we can immediately begin accountability work with a harm doer. But taking a survivor who just experienced harm and saying, okay, we're going to sit with this person now, that's not helpful for a survivor. Now, some survivors can move through to a healing space faster than others. But going from sexual assault to sitting with a perpetrator right away, it's just not best practice. It's not safe. It's not best practice. But that's different from accountability work, which can happen right away.
About what percentage of the wrongdoers you're working with have also gone through the legal system and been held accountable or not in that process?
None.
Okay.
None.
So you were working with folks who are, this is the alternative, not an add-on.
Yes, because most of the survivors I work with want nothing to do with the criminal legal system.
Because it doesn't work for survivors? Is that why? I'm making light of it, but it just doesn't. Yeah. Super harmful to go through that. I mean, I'm not discouraging, and I know you're not discouraging anyone from going through that, but boy, if a survivor comes to me and they want to go to local law enforcement, I prep them for very low expectations at every stage of the process, whether it's the officer taking the report or telling them, or, the common thing I receive is, or the survivor will receive that I witnessed is, why are you bringing this in? And I'll have to say, oh, it's because, it's a felony offense under California, such and such. So you are obligated actually to take a report to the detective stage where they're going to be, treated like they're on trial and not believed, and reverse chronologies and, really challenging their memories, which don't tend to be all there or linear for many of them if it just happened, to the working with the prosecutor to actually, if you go into a courtroom, that's a horrific process for survivors because it's not about the truth. It's just a character assassination on the stand. So is that why they're choosing restorative justice?
Yes.
Yeah, as another alternative. I mean, it'd be great if all of these processes were integrated, maybe.
Right. And let's be clear, like if a survivor came to me and said, I want to go to the police, I would be the first person to walk into a police station with a survivor, because it is always about survivor choice. It is not about me and what I believe is right. It is what the survivor wants. So I will always support survivors and what they feel is right for them. And I have never had a survivor come to me and say, that criminal legal process was like so healing for me. It just doesn't happen. And so that is why survivors are seeking alternative outcomes that can be healing for them. Restorative justice takes a very long time. It is very deliberate. It can still be harmful for survivors. Like hearing that it is taking so long and that the person who harmed them is having a really hard time taking accountability. It's hard for survivors to hear. It's still not as harmful as the criminal legal process that is nothing but a character assassination and a questioning of their sexual practices and a questioning of their memory. And it's horrible. And survivors are not gaining much from that system.
And those who go through it, please get a great attorney, talk to survivor advocates to help you through the process at every stage, because you'll need it. So we have the legal process, we have restorative justice. Just one last question to wrap this up. What are some other ways that you've encountered that survivors define as justice?
Those are the two. Some survivors do define the criminal legal process as justice. And there are people for whom prison is necessary, right? There are people who will never take accountability, who will never acknowledge the impact of the harm that they have caused, who will harm over and over and over again, who don't play well in public, and they need to be locked up. And that's not most people who perpetrate harm. So that's the ampersand, right? We can hold both of these things to be true. So that is justice for some people. And justice is also hearing, I'm sorry that I harmed you, and hearing, I did this to you. It was my fault. I'm here to answer your questions. I'm here to take real responsibility. That is what so many survivors just wish that they could have, right? I just wanted him to acknowledge that he hurt me. That means everything.
That's a great place to end. And thank you for your sophistication in embracing all of this complexity, because people think they're right and wrong answers in addressing sexual violence and identifying the causes and consequences and prevention and what justice means. And you're saying, well, no, it's not one size fits all, but here's a different approach that's more human-centered than our current systems. And you're really advancing this as a form of justice, right, for survivors. And that's the key. It's survivor-centered. It's also wrongdoer-centered. It's people-centered, but it's survivor-centered in a way that very much centers on their healing. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your time and your expertise. And hopefully everyone out there got as much out of this as I did. Thank you so much, Dr. Ackerman.
It's always a pleasure.
Take care, y'all. Hopefully you got some comfort from the little kitties who make an appearance. And we're really honored that you're joining us with our End Rape Expert interview series. Check out our website. We have a whole campaign running to try to reduce rates of sexual violence and increase awareness about this pressing epidemic. Again, thank you, Dr. Ackerman, and have a great day, y'all.